Nintendo's Famicom had taken Japan by storm throughout the 1980s, becoming a cultural and commercial phenomenon. Creators from across the country prospered during this time, and there were numerous innovations. One such innovation came in 1986, when a team of unique collaborators produced the first true role-playing game made for home consoles and the Japanese market. That game was Dragon Quest, and it became a huge success story. But even though that success was far from guaranteed, plans were already laid down for the production of a sequel, as the developers felt there were too many ideas they'd left over. Their ambition for this sequel was to therefore get one step closer to fulfilling the full scope of their original vision, while further tapping into the Famicom's potential and introducing role-playing games to even more players. The result of their efforts went on to become one of the more unique entries in the series, and it was called Dragon Quest II: Luminaries of the Legendary Line. The original Dragon Quest was the result of a unique collaboration of up-and-coming talent from across Japan. It was helmed by Yuji Horii, a game columnist from Weekly Shonen Jump and a game designer in his own right, and predominantly coded by Koichi Nakamura, a prodigal programmer and founder of Chunsoft. Illustrations were then provided by Akira Toriyama, creator of the new hit manga Dragon Ball, and music came from the renowned composer Koichi Sugiyama. Their goal had been to make a role-playing game akin to the Western hits Ultima and Wizardry, but tailor-made for the Nintendo Famicom, as opposed to merely trying to emulate the RPGs that had become popular on personal computers. Given the seeming demand for role-playing games in Japan at the time, and the demand of the Famicom, they expected Dragon Quest to be a runaway success, and they weren't alone in that thinking. Enix, for example, who had published Dragon Quest, started to adopt a different approach to publishing, perhaps in preparation for the financial returns they hoped Dragon Quest would deliver. Starting out as a publisher of PC games, their initial wave of products was based on submissions to their competitions, but they then started rehiring some of those creators, using whatever they came up with next to supplement the next wave of games that came via their competitions in the latter half of 1983. Throughout the year, this meant Enix published 35 separate games across the various PC platforms, and they adopted a similar approach in 1984, but the emphasis was far more on established creators than unearthing new ones. Of the 21 published games, this meant only 3 came via their third Game Hobby Program contest, and some of the games were now based on licensed properties, such as Arale no Jump Up and Dr. Slump Bubble Daisakusen, which were based on the manga produced by Toriyama called Dr. Slump, and Wingman, which was based on the Wingman manga series. 1985 followed a similar trend, as Enix no longer held the Game Hobby Program contest, and had even started overseeing the production of ports for games like Xevious and Pac-Land. This saw a further reduction of concurrent projects, with only 15 games published throughout the year. 1986 then saw a huge departure. Prior to the release of Dragon Quest on the Famicom in May, Enix published only 3 PC games: a sequel to Wingman, with music provided by Koichi Sugiyama, a pool game by Takashi Shimizu, who had been a winner during Enix's second Game Hobby Program contest, and a game based on Fist of the North Star. After that, the only further PC game that was released throughout the remainder of the year was a PC port of Dragon Quest. By this point, the Famicom version had started to deliver on those initial expectations, and any concerns Enix had about the strategic decision they'd made were pushed aside. But those concerns only existed because Horii and Nakamura were 100% convinced that Dragon Quest had a future beyond just one game, and they had already begun planning in earnest. Planning on Dragon Quest II started in early April 1986, almost as soon as the master of Dragon Quest had been sent off to Nintendo for production, and nearly 2 months before it was eventually shipped to consumers. But they did not actually have Enix's permission to do so. Horii and Nakamura were just passionate and assumed that such a request would be made if Dragon Quest performed upon release. When that scenario ended up occurring, Yokinobu Chiba, who had served as the producer on Dragon Quest, asked what their plans were regarding a follow-up. He promptly learned that planning was already underway, So the next question was around how long they thought development would take. Without much forethought, Nakamura offhandedly stated that the game would be ready to ship that same November. Given that Dragon Quest had only taken 5 months from conception through to delivery, this was a very modest timeline in theory, as it would give them around 8 months to finish the project. Knowing that the sequel had to continue to lead players into the world of role-playing games, the team started with spirited debates about the direction for Dragon Quest II. The intent to use a party was set very early on, but that raised a new question in its own right. How many characters should be at the player's control? Something that was further complicated by Hori being adamant that every party member should be visible on screen. In PC role-playing games, it wasn't unheard of for the lead character to stand in for the entire party. Hori felt the Famicom, with its superior graphics, should break this mold. But while the Famicom was more powerful than the Apple II or PC-88, it still had limitations. After some experimentation and debate, the team found that 3 characters was the optimal party size, at least if Hori had his wish of having the whole party visible. Given the size and style of Dragon Quest's character models, the most characters they could display together was 4, so the party was set at 3, so they could still speak to an NPC. Another factor at play was the password system, also known as the Spell of Restoration. The Famicom version of Dragon Quest utilised a 20-character code to save and restore a player's progress, since the cartridge didn't have a battery to store the save data. Players returned to the king at the starting point and spoke to him to receive an updated password. Then, when they started to play the game again, they simply needed to re-enter that password at the main menu. It seemed like a random string of characters, but this string contained the hero's data, such as plot progression, experience, and equipment. It took 20 characters to store this data for Dragon Quest's sole playable character, and this presented something of a problem. Nakamura experimented thoroughly to try and find an optimal solution, and managed to cap the password at a maximum of 52 characters, slightly less than 20 characters per playable character. But while the plan was to eventually have 3 controllable heroes, they wanted Dragon Quest II to still start out with a single protagonist. Hori was aware that some people might try Dragon Quest II without having played the original game, and he didn't want to make things too complicated for those players. Furthermore, it was a natural step forward for those who had played the first game. This setup allowed the game to ease players, new and old, into managing 3 separate characters, and learn how to apply their varied abilities appropriately. It took the team a few months to lay all this groundwork down, so proper development started in early July of 1986. The team split again into their specialties, either scenario or programming. Hori devised a new story set in the same world as Dragon Quest, but 100 years later, and in a different region. He also wanted to use the scenario detail to distinguish the 3 playable characters. The initial character was therefore a prince who was descended from the previous game's hero, and their first order of business was to seek out their cousins, the prince and princesses of neighbouring kingdoms. Each was given a traditional role-playing class, not unlike those found in Ultima, Wizardry or Dungeons & Dragons. The main hero, who was the prince of a place called Middenhall, was positioned as a traditional warrior. But unlike the game's previous hero, who was able to wield magic, this prince was strictly a melee fighter. It was the second party member, the Prince of Canuk, who inherited the ability to fight and use magic, acting as sort of a warrior priest. The third party member, the Princess of Moonbrook, was then made a wizard with powerful healing and offensive spells. Hori had already concocted the general storyline, where the hero set out to vanquish the evil wizard Hagen. However, the bulk of developing the scenario consisted of planning all the environments and text in-game. Using heaps of graph paper, Hori and Hiroshi Maioka, who returned as scenario assistant, sketched out maps of Dragon Quest II's enlarged world. Considering events were planned to take place in these locations, they wanted to make sure that they knew where NPCs were going to stand, and what information those NPCs would impart to the player. They developed dungeons using a similar process, planning which items to give through chests and where specific enemies should be found. Those enemies were once again illustrated by Toriyama. As before, Hori provided Toriyama with a list of concepts, including rough data such as tree-human hybrid, and this came alongside a quick summary of the moves they might use and the personality they should convey. With this information, Toriyama devised illustrations, and the scenario team then finalised the monsters' names and parameters. This time though, Toriyama worried that some of the monsters he created may be too similar to beings he'd already made for his own properties, and that this sentiment was exacerbated by Dragon Quest II having such a vast array of creatures. Whereas the original game featured only 40 monsters with a couple of sprite variations, Dragon Quest II ultimately shipped with 82 monsters, with only 5 designs carried over from the previous game. But this vast bestiary was required to help fill out the much bigger world. Dragon Quest II featured twice as many dungeons to explore, and the overworld based on sprite size was over 6 times as large. Alfgard, the region explored in Dragon Quest, was even folded into Dragon Quest II's map. When players then visited this familiar land, they wanted it to feel special, and this is where music came into play. So for continuity, they brought back the original overworld theme, Unknown World. For music in the broader sense, Sugiyama produced an original score that ended up being approximately 6 minutes longer than the original soundtrack for Dragon Quest. The overture returned triumphantly for the title screen, effectively promoting it as the official theme of Dragon Quest in the process. However, as the new story was set 100 years after the original, Sugiyama went for a very different tone. To reflect the feel of a comparatively modern era, he took inspiration from pop music, which was immediately displayed on the main menu, where a new, upbeat piece called Joyous Song played. Some of the Baroque influence still shone through, like the new castle theme which blended the two tones. However, one defining element of the game's previous score was removed, as the dungeon theme no longer got lower and slower as the player descended. All this work then had to be converted into the game by Chunsoft's programming team. Toriyama's monster designs were again translated into pixel format by Takashi Yasuno, a high school classmate of Nakamura and one of the 7 founding members of Chunsoft. The sequel's visual identity did change in one dramatic way though. With the shift to multiple characters and monsters being shown on screen, it was necessary to restructure the look of battles. Combat no longer took place in a window overlaid on the map, with a new battle scene created. Transportation was another factor, given the much larger scale of the map. To facilitate this, and keep gameplay from getting stale by walking everywhere, the team introduced a boat. Random enemies could still be encountered while at sea though, meaning the party was never truly safe outside of city walls. The larger world also necessitated another change to the save system. No longer was it feasible to expect players to return to the king to save their game and get the password. Thus the system was changed so that players could speak to any king or minister in the game in order to save. However, as production went on, the team began to run into considerable issues with the Famicom's cartridge. Despite Nakamura's breakthroughs in compression and storing information efficiently, a number of elements had to be cut from Dragon Quest II. While the bestiary was impressive, it was originally intended to be much closer to 100 monsters. Hori and Toriyama had also planned for several large illustrations to be used at certain moments, to help bring big plot developments to life in a way that simple sprites could not. These pictures were inspired by the traditional Kamishibai illustrations, a classic method of storytelling in Japan in the 1930s. Toriyama had finished these illustrations, and they had been converted into the game, but because of the sheer size, they had to be abandoned later in development. One did end up appearing in the Famicom manual though, albeit in black and white form. The Alfgard region from the original game also ended up being scaled down to save size, so that focus could be maintained on new areas, while an entire other area, the promontory of Olivia, was removed and set aside for potential use in another game. Even areas that remained were affected by cuts. Many treasure chests in the final game were left empty, as the items they were supposed to contain were removed. Among the cut items was a particularly unusual one known as the Dangerous Swimsuit. This was an exclusive item for the Princess of Moonbrook, which would have altered her sprite while having comparable stats to the mink coat. Perhaps the biggest casualty, however, was a pair of changes to the ending. The original vision was much grander, with a parade of familiar faces stopping by to congratulate the heroes, culminating in a glamorous courtroom dance. Hori had also devised a bad ending, where the Prince of Canuck sacrificed himself to defeat the final boss. The remaining 2 heroes then returned as normal, sharing the good and bad news, but as the celebrations began, the fallen prince's sister, the Princess of Canuck, suddenly swooped in to blame the hero and fatally stab him. It's not clear how this alternate outcome could have been triggered, but Hori cut the twist for 2 reasons. One, capacity issues, but he also felt upon reflection that it would have been too grim for the series' tone. Capacity issues aside, Nakamura himself found the development of Dragon Quest II much more challenging than the first, despite being more experienced. He was still, after all, only a 22-year-old university student, and he was juggling his studies alongside being the president of Chunsoft and his senior development duties. As such, Dragon Quest II marked a considerable shift in the games industry. Up until this point, it wasn't uncommon for one skilled programmer to code an entire game, but given the sheer scale of Dragon Quest II and the November deadline Nakamura had set, he decided to call in assistants, bringing in 5 new student programmers onto the project. In some respects, this lessened his workload, but Nakamura underestimated how much time would be taken up on leadership tasks. He struggled with delegation and communication, and as all his hires were also students, their priorities didn't always align with what his priorities were, something that even deteriorated into arguments and finger-pointing. Despite this, Dragon Quest II was finished on time, or at least it was in theory. On the day the final version was meant to be sent in for production, Nakamura and Hori realised that not one single person on the development team had actually played the game from start to finish. Hori himself had only played the first section multiple times up until receiving the boat, but he'd never played the back half. As the team began to actually play through the finished version, they made a startling realisation. It was brutally hard. Hori and Nakamura knew the game could not be released in this state, as they risked alienating their existing fanbase. If Dragon Quest II was impossible for the adults who made it, how on earth could they release it to the public and their young key demographic who were still quite new to the concept of role-playing games? They felt they had no choice but to postpone, but the release date had just been announced in Shonen Jump's November the 11th issue. Fortunately, by this point, the original Dragon Quest had started to become a huge success, so there was some credit in the bank. Ultimately, after negotiations, the team was given 1 month to get the game fixed, and they immediately put their noses to the grindstone. The main problem was that the encounters just weren't balanced, and even with the additional party members, the difficulty ramped up too quickly. Initially, Nakamura devised a fight simulation program as a debugging tool, allowing the team to set player data and test out each encounter without having to fully replay the game. The strategy didn't pan out properly though. The simulator helped tune the encounters for each individual group of monsters, but when played normally, fighting consecutive battles in dungeons for example, was still incredibly hard. In this setup, Dragon Quest II was so hard that playtesters couldn't even reach the Prince of Canuck. The only way to properly fine-tune the game's balance was to just play from the beginning, with as many playtesters as they could recruit. They therefore had to call on the assistance of every single Enix employee, and they would bring feedback directly to Hori, such as the prices of the items are too high or it takes too long to level up. Hori then had to verify the feedback and fax changes to Nakamura's office at Chunsoft, where revisions were made to a new prototype build. The revised code was then distributed to playtesters and the process repeated. At the start of this playtesting marathon, new prototypes were compiled every 4 to 5 days, but towards the end, prototype builds were being issued multiple times a day. Balancing Dragon Quest II required more than just tweaking stats though, and the world's design itself underwent some last-minute changes. To help players reach new party members quicker, Hori adjusted the initial areas, limiting the number of monsters per battle to 3 and moving Canuck Castle closer. It was a monumental task, but by their new deadline in mid-December, the game was ready to ship, even though Hori still felt the game wasn't as balanced as it could have been. With more time, he was confident they could have found the perfect balance, but he didn't want to make the children wait any longer. And due to a combination of sleepless nights and stress, he'd also developed a pretty nasty stomach ulcer. It meant all they could do was just hope the public appreciated their efforts when the game was eventually in their hands. Before the delay at the absolute 11th hour of development, Enix had unfortunately advertised Dragon Quest II's December launch. They had chosen Shonen Jump to announce the release date, because 1986 had been a banner year for the magazine, driven not only by Toriyama's Dragon Ball, but other influential manga like Saint Seiya, Captain Tsubasa, and Fist of the North Star. It meant Enix, by doing this, was reaching almost 5 million potential customers. Previews also ran through Famitsu's December issues as the fevered playtesting period was winding down. Given the late delay, many of the images printed in these previews did not match up with the final game, showing that the Canuck region was not the only area altered considerably in the home stretch. Alfgard's inclusion was teased, claiming that the original region was changed over the last 100 years, though in the final game, it hadn't changed much at all. The previews and advertising campaign also focused on the increasing scale of the game, like the world map being so much larger and the sheer quantity of monsters, items, and spells along the journey. Even the fact that there were 200 NPCs to talk to was a cause for hype. Needless to say, NX were unfettered by the unexpected delay, and they pushed their marketing even harder. They capitalised on the first game's acclaimed soundtrack when advertising the sequel, with the overture featuring in TV commercials. And they even commissioned a rearrangement of Joyous Song, converting it into a proper pop track called Looking for a Love Song, performed by a new idol singer named Anna Makino. They were also helped by the original Dragon Quest winning awards. It won Famitsu's grand prize, beating out Gradius and The Legend of Zelda. And it meant that the delay seemed to work in the game's favour, building even more anticipation, as when Dragon Quest II eventually launched on the 26th of January 1987, sales were much higher right out of the gate. During its initial launch window, over 724,000 copies were sold, more than double would have been achieved by the original Dragon Quest. And in the next reporting period, it sold another 350,000, taking Dragon Quest II over the million mark in just a few weeks. This generated unprecedented levels of revenue for NX. Those opening weeks resulted in consumers spending almost 6 billion yen, or around $114 million when adjusted for inflation. The other bonus was that sales of Dragon Quest surged. During the launch period of Dragon Quest II, the original game rose to number 23 on the charts, but it then rose higher to number 12 in the following period and maintained this position for many more weeks until the further finally fired down a few months later. Those sales were bolstered by positive ratings from critics. Famitsu had only just begun publishing scores for new games after the release of Dragon Quest, but they awarded Dragon Quest II a 38 out of 40. They cited its ultimate influences and declared Hori a star in the Famicom world. The Legend of Zelda 2 was reviewed in the same issue, scoring 1 point lower, and the editors advised that if readers had to choose between the two, they should go with Dragon Quest. Likewise, Family Computer Magazine awarded it one of the highest scores in their 13-year history, scoring it nearly perfect in all categories and awarding it a 28 out of 30. This combination saw NX make the news, with reports of crowds of customers lined up outside stores to get their own copies. By the end of the initial run, it became clear to everyone that Dragon Quest II had made an incredible impact on Japanese gamers, and come the following January, Famitsu awarded it their Game of the Year prize for 1987. All this success though came in spite of one glaring problem, as even though they had done extra months of rigorous playtesting, Dragon Quest II was still nefariously hard. Miyako, who had been Hori's lieutenant throughout, even joked that he must be the most hated person in Japan, as he was personally responsible for designing the penultimate dungeon, the Cave of Renderak, which quickly became notorious amongst players. Nakamura was mortified that the final product had turned out this way, and despite its huge commercial success, he even considered quitting the games industry altogether. However, he was heartened by the sight of players of all ages helping each other out. Yes, the difficulty was steep, but the power of human word of mouth helped counteract it, and this turned Nakamura around. The game was just so popular, and there were so many people talking about it, sharing strategies and anecdotes. Instead of turning players away, Dragon Quest II's difficulty had helped to galvanize them. At the time, a difficult game in the Japanese market was likely to be either heavily edited for release in North America, or just overlooked and skipped entirely. There was a sense amongst Japanese companies that North Americans were adverse to adversity in their games, preferring them to be much easier to digest and complete. Furthermore, the original game, released as Dragon Warrior in North America due to copyright issues, had infamously struggled to gain a foothold, making the sequel's chances of being localized even slimmer. Yet Nintendo of America still proceeded with Dragon Warrior 2, aiming to put it on sale just over a year after the original. They just hoped their gamble, whereby Dragon Warrior was given away to Nintendo Power subscribers, might eventually pay off. NX and Nintendo utilized the same basic strategies in terms of localizing the second game. Toriyama's artwork for the packaging was replaced with a more generic version, one that essentially honored the idea of Toriyama's original, but in the style of a pulp western fantasy novel cover. The game itself continued to employ the same lofty Renaissance fair level English, with familiar turns of phrase like, "but thou must," returning. While Nintendo's content policies meant specific use of religious symbols had to be removed, including the use of coffins with crosses to represent fallen party members. But Dragon Warrior 2 actually boasted some new content not seen in the Japanese release. For example, a new intro to the story was conceived depicting the attack on Moonbrook that sets the plot in motion. And whereas Dragon Quest II began with a soldier telling the king and prince of Middenhall about the incident, Dragon Warrior 2 was updated to show it outright, along with a prologue setting the scene, thereby increasing the cinematic production of the game. The title screen was also enhanced, showing the heroes march towards the screen one by one, as if demonstrating that the party was expanding. The game's title was given in-game though as Dragon Warrior Part 2, diverging from the text on the packaging. Once again, the North American version benefited from a battery save system instead of using the 52-character password system. However, despite the game's reputation for being difficult and the wide time between the Japanese and North American releases, Dragon Warrior 2 did not receive any major adjustments to make it easier for English-speaking players. Experience values awarded for defeating certain monsters were slightly adjusted, but otherwise it was the same daunting gauntlet. Dragon Warrior 2 was eventually released in North America in September of 1990, over 4 years after its original Japanese release. The advertising campaign highlighted it as the #1 RPG in Japan and touted offers for free strategy guides. But history repeated itself. North American critics were less than impressed, something not helped by FCI's port of Ultima 4 releasing the same month. EGM still didn't see what Japanese gamers liked about Dragon Quest, and were even harsher this time around, scoring Dragon Warrior 2 as a 24 out of 40. They compared it unfavourably to Ultima, dismissing it as little more than an underachieving clone or wannabe. GamePro was a little more forgiving, praising it as a good place to start playing role-playing games, and even encouraging readers to revisit the first game for the full experience. But despite their collaboration the previous year, Nintendo Power had little to say, beyond some obligatory mentions in the tips and tricks section. Ultimately, Dragon Warrior 2 was estimated to have only sold around 150,000 copies, and there was no giveaway this time to bail the game out. To make matters worse, their upstart competitor in Japan, Final Fantasy, was faring much better with North American audiences. To this day, Dragon Quest II is still named as the most difficult in the series by fans, and similarly, Nakamura considers its development the hardest challenge of his professional career. However, its launch also ended up becoming one of the best moments of his career, as the development team witnessed the historic lines of people waiting to buy it and the camaraderie that came afterwards. Seeing fans being brought to tears by the ending theme at concerts likewise made Nakamura very proud and emotional, knowing that it was not only the memory of the game's difficulty that brought tears to their eyes, but the sense of accomplishment when they overcame it. Sugiyama's score was also an important part of the game's legacy. Once again, the symphonic suite followed immediately on the game's heels, releasing just 2 weeks after, coinciding so closely with the game's launch that the album's packaging art still showed obsolete, incorrect screenshots from before the delay. The Tokyo String Ensemble, conducted by Sugiyama himself, returned for this initial performance. The ending theme, which became known as My Road, My Journey, was also given the single treatment. New lyrics recounted the hero's perspective, and the theme was rearranged and performed by Kazuo Eiichi, a politician who'd represented Japan's Liberal Democratic Party since 1976 and had some experience singing publicly. Both My Road, My Journey and Looking for a Love Song have been re-recorded and rearranged often since, becoming Dragon Quest II's biggest musical legacy. Since the Famicom era, Dragon Quest II has been inexorably tied to its predecessor, and hasn't been sold separately in all of its remasters and updates. A Super Famicom version brought the original duo back to new and old fans alike in 1993. Moving to a 16-bit console allowed Chunsoft to bring forth the backgrounds for battles, in addition to a plethora of quality of life improvements like revised location layouts and increased storage. This iteration also brought the formerly English exclusive intro to Japanese players for the first time, and it was made slightly easier by tweaking stats for the heroes and monsters alike. But a new side quest saw the Prince of Canuck suffer a curse under specific circumstances, so players either had to seek out the cure or carry on with only 2 characters. Beating the game this way even altered this scenario slightly, with the prince being fully healed and a bit sad when the heroes returned. Between the Super Famicom version and the Game Boy Color port in 1999, this updated Dragon Quest 1 and 2 package sold over 2 million copies combined, and it's soon to be brought forward to a new generation via the Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD 2D remake for all modern platforms. Square Enix's Team Asano, also known as Creative Studio 5, is overhauling the game with their signature graphical style, bringing Torland to life in a whole new way. Furthermore, Nakamura's dream for a bigger party will be realised in this iteration. As part of the package, the Princess of Canuck is being added as a 4th party member. In many ways, Dragon Quest II was a tremendous achievement for Hori, Nakamura and the entire team. They churned out a substantial sequel to their first game, continuing to build upon their innovations and realise their full vision bit by bit. Yet even as they strove to continue making role-playing games accessible to younger audiences, they almost veered into disaster. Dragon Quest II's difficulty could have easily sunk its entire reputation, if not for the fact that, instead of deterring players, they rallied around the challenge and helped each other to overcome it. This determination from the players validated Enix's gamble, proving that they were wise to put their faith in their new Wonder Team, even when they requested an extra month of unplanned labour right at the end of development that forced them to delay the launch of a game they'd only just announced a release date of. The sequel, though, was the beginning of the series' cultural status, as the lines of consumers clamouring to buy it proved to be the founders of a time-honoured tradition. For all its faults, Dragon Quest II was a formative moment for Enix, and a crucial step forward towards the series' destiny as Japan's most beloved role-playing game franchise. But that concludes our journey. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. My name is Darryl, and together with Chris, we hope you enjoyed listening to the incredible development history of Dragon Quest II. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing a video like this by giving it a like. Because as we're a new channel, any interactions you make really do help us out. We're also really thankful for the support we've received so far on Patreon. Patreon supporters get access to history videos like this one a week early. So if you sign up now, you'll soon be able to get access to the next episode in the series, which is focused on Ys, as well as a full bonus episode on Hydralide that's Patreon exclusive. You can find out more at patreon.com/datalog. Alright everyone, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.